Genesis 22, verse 1. 4 words in the Hebrew. And God tested Abraham. No reason given, no build-up. The text simply states that God told a man to take his only son up a mountain and kill him, and readers have spent 3,000 years asking why a God who claims to value human life would issue that order with no explanation at all. There is a manuscript that answers that question. It was copied at Qumran before the time of Christ, preserved in full only in the highland monasteries of Ethiopia, and it tells a different story. In this version, God did not wake up one morning and decide to test Abraham. Someone walked into the divine court and proposed it. The text names him. It is not God's idea, it is his. In the next 18 minutes, you'll see the actual verses, the manuscript evidence behind them, and why this version of the story was never allowed into the Bible you grew up reading. If forbidden biblical history fascinates you, hit subscribe. Every week we uncover what was removed from Scripture. The book is Jubilees, composed sometime between 170 and 150 BCE, almost certainly by a priestly author in Judea who treated himself not as a novelist, but as a transmitter of revelation. The text claims to be dictated to Moses on Sinai by an angel, retelling Genesis with the gaps filled in. It was not a fringe document. 15 separate copies of Jubilees turned up among the Dead Sea Scrolls, more than survive of most books that did make it into the Hebrew Bible. The Qumran community treated it as scripture, not commentary. Fragment 4, Q219, and several companion fragments preserve portions of the Isaac material directly, in Hebrew, copied centuries before any surviving Christian text. The complete version of Jubilees exists today in only one place. Ge'ez, the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, copied generation after generation in monastic scriptoria at Aksum and on the island monasteries of Lake Tana. The Western Church dropped Jubilees from its canon at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. Ethiopia never did. James Vanderkam's 1989 critical edition, built from both the Qumran Hebrew and the Ge'ez tradition, is the modern academic standard, and it's where the Mastema material is preserved in full, unsoftened. So before we get to what the text says, understand what kind of object we're dealing with. Not a medieval legend, not a folk retelling, but a Second Temple period composition treated as authoritative scripture by the very community that buried it in jars at Qumran 2,000 years ago, preserved independently on 2 continents, in 2 languages, with the same names attached. Read Genesis 22 on its own, and the silence is the problem. God speaks. Abraham obeys. There is no scene of deliberation, no stated reason, no adversary, no court. Compare that to the only other place in the Hebrew Bible where God tests a righteous man this severely, the book of Job. There, the testing of Job is preceded by an entire scene, a heavenly court, sons of God presenting themselves, and a figure called Ha-Satan, the accuser, a title not yet a proper name, stepping forward to argue that Job's righteousness is conditional and proposing the test himself. Genesis 22 has no equivalent scene. The author of Jubilees noticed that gap and filled it, using almost exactly the Job template but applied to Abraham and Isaac instead. Jubilees chapter 17. Abraham has just sent Hagar and Ishmael away. The text shifts into a heavenly scene that Genesis never describes. A figure called the Prince of Mastema. In Hebrew, Mastema means hostility or accusation, the same root behind the later idea of Satan, comes before God. He points to Abraham's love for Isaac and argues that the love itself should be tested. If Abraham is told to offer his son as a burnt offering and he obeys, then his devotion is proven. If he refuses, it is exposed as conditional. According to the text, God does not initiate the test. God responds to the proposal, and the command to Abraham follows immediately afterward, essentially identical in substance to the Genesis wording. but now sitting downstream of a scene Genesis never includes. Jubilees 18 follows the binding itself almost beat for beat with Genesis. The wood, the altar, the knife raised, but adds a coda Genesis doesn't have. Once Abraham has shown he will not withhold his son, the text says Mastema is shamed by the outcome, and Jubilees explicitly credits the angel who calls out to stop Abraham's hand with having prevented Mastema from claiming a victory. That is not a detail Genesis contains in any form. It is Jubilees' interpretive addition, built to answer a question Genesis never raises and Job already answers for a different character. The mainstream explanation is straightforward and worth stating fairly. Jubilees is doing what a lot of Second Temple literature does. It's filling a narrative gap by borrowing a structure that already existed in Scripture. The author had access to Job. Job has a court scene with a prosecuting angelic figure. Genesis 22 has an unexplained divine command. Splice them together and you get exactly the text we have. Most academic treatments, including Vanderkam's own commentary, read it this way. Not a suppressed truth, but a documented and fairly common technique of rewritten Bible literature in the period. But the manuscript pattern is worth laying out honestly, because it's more consistent than a single author's invention would predict. The Mastema figure does not appear only in the Isaac episode. He appears across Jubilees as a recurring antagonist. He's the one, in chapter 10, who negotiates with God to keep a fraction of demonic spirits operating in the world after the flood, on the explicit grounds that humanity needs an adversary to be tested by. He appears again in chapter 48, where Jubilees identifies him, not Pharaoh, not Egypt's gods, as the figure who tries to kill Moses on the road back to Egypt, and who later strengthens Pharaoh's magicians against Moses at the Red Sea. That's the pattern that matters. Jubilees consistently relocates moments of divine testing or near catastrophe in the Torah onto this one recurring figure, across at least 3 separate narrative cycles: the Flood, the Akedah, and the Exodus, written by what current scholarship treats as a single coherent authorial hand, not a patchwork of unrelated traditions. Whether you read that as theology or invention, it is not a one-off gap-filling flourish. It's a structural feature of the entire book. Here's the detail most popular treatments skip. Robert Henry Charles, whose 1902 English edition was the standard for most of the 20th century, translated the Mastema material accurately in substance, but consistently rendered Prince Mastema in ways that nudged English readers toward reading him as a fairly minor, almost bureaucratic angelic functionary, a prosecuting official, not a rival power. Vanderkam's 1989 edition, working from a fuller manuscript base including the Qumran Hebrew, preserved the harsher edges Charles had smoothed, a figure who is repeatedly described as ruling over a portion of spirits, who negotiates directly with God as something closer to an equal party than a subordinate messenger, and who is explicitly described in chapter 17 as wanting Abraham's test to fail. That distinction matters because it changes what the text is actually claiming. A minor functionary carrying out an assignment is one thing. A named adversarial power proposing the death of a child to prove a point, and being described as disappointed when the boy lives, that is a different claim entirely, and it's the one the Qumran Hebrew and the Ge'ez tradition both preserve. The Council of Laodicea in 364 CE produced one of the earliest formal canon lists in Christian history, and Jubilees, like 1st Enoch, did not survive it. The stated objections to this whole family of texts centered on excessive angelology, too much named detail about the structure of the heavenly realm, too much specificity about who does what and why. Jerome, working on the Latin Vulgate a few decades later, knew Jubilees by its other name, the Little Genesis, and explicitly set it aside as apocryphal. It never entered the Latin Bible, and without a Latin translation it dropped out of Western liturgical and theological use almost entirely for over 1,000 years. A text that puts a named adversarial figure in the room for Abraham's hardest test, rather than leaving the command as an unexplained act of God, is not a comfortable addition to a tradition built around the idea that God's commands, however difficult, require no further explanation. Jubilees doesn't deny that God allowed the test, but it refuses to let the proposal originate with God, and that refusal is precisely the kind of theological problem a canon committee in the 4th century had both the authority and the motive to edit out. Ethiopia, again, did not inherit that motive. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church kept Jubilees canonical without interruption, and its Akedah, its binding of Isaac, has carried Mastema's proposal in unbroken liturgical use for over 1,000 years, while the rest of Christianity told a version of the story with the question simply left open. Strip away the framing, and what's left is simple. Genesis says God tested Abraham and gives no reason. Jubilees, copied at Qumran before Christianity existed and preserved unbroken in Ethiopia ever since, says the proposal came from somewhere else, from a figure who shows up at the flood, shows up again at the Red Sea, and shows up here, arguing that a father's love for his son should be tested to its absolute limit. You don't have to take a position on whether that figure is real to notice what the manuscript record proves. This isn't a medieval invention or a modern reinterpretation. It's a 2,200-year-old reading of one of the hardest verses in the Bible, preserved independently in 2 languages on 2 continents, and it was never allowed back into the book most people think tells the whole story. Genesis says God tested Abraham. Jubilees says someone asked him to. The text has carried that distinction for over 2,000 years. It's still there, in Hebrew at Qumran, in Gaze in the highlands of Ethiopia, the only place that never stopped reading it that way.